Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I am Jeremy Birmingham. This is another episode of Talking Stuff where myself and my good friend Andrew Ellis are going to break down some of the important happenings in the world of Ohio State football recruiting. We're going to get right to it. Let's bring on Andrew and get to the show. Welcome back, Andrew. It's a couple days now since the dust has settled on the most recent visit to Ohio State for Keon Keeley, I don't want to say unquestioned top target for Ohio State at defensive end in the class of 2023, but certainly right up there as either 1A, 1B, or 1C, or maybe even like 1AA, I guess, if you're talking about it with Damon Wilson and Mateo Uiagalelei, just because I think the culture fit for Keon Keeley is so good that it's hard to imagine anyone else in that situation or in that position would be a better qualifying person for Ohio State. Like, they just love everything about Keon Keeley. And, I don't like to immediately talk about visits like on Sunday, because Sunday seems like the day when everyone's at their most optimistic and everyone that you talk to is in a great mood and a great place and things are perfect and they can't get bad. It's now Tuesday as we sit here and talk about this. Tuesday brought, negativity, everyone's favorite negativity. And Andrew, before we even just dive into the particulars of Keon Keeley's recruitment, where things stand with him in Ohio State, I want to ask you this question. If the supposed or projected primary contender for Keon Keeley was anyone but Alabama, do you feel like Ohio State fans, and in some way yourself, because I know you're pulling your hair out about this. That's a hair joke.
Yes.
So do you think that you would feel this this kind of way if it wasn't Bama?
Not really. Like, I think it's just it's Bama. We say that so many times; it's just become a common theme with Caleb Downs, Justice Haynes. It's Bama. That's the line you use. I mean, I would say Georgia would be the only other team that you would even put close to that tier right now on the trail. But no, if this were Florida or Penn State or Michigan or Notre Dame or USC, I think the thoughts from the fan base would be entirely different.
Yeah, and I get it. I mean, I really do get it. It's been a bad run against Alabama. They have pretty much dominated Ohio State on the field the last time they played, and then in the recruiting world ever since. And that's just what happens. Now, as we've talked about on this show a couple of times, that's not the case at wide receiver. I don't know that it has to be the case at defensive end. And that is ultimately, as we sit here and try to talk about Keon Keeley and the fit, I want to go back to Saturday night, him when he arrived at Ohio Stadium. I don't know that I've seen a player, maybe the last time I saw someone get this much attention from Ohio State as an entire administration was when Donovan Peoples-Jones visited back in, what was it, 2016. And, that's the type of day where you have Gene Smith like being there to make sure he's talking to a recruit and talking to a recruit's parents, and every coach coming by, every recruit, players on the team, every single person in the building, 105,000 people are aware of Keon Keeley's presence. And that's very unusual when it comes to recruiting. I think that there is no doubt, and I've said this before and I'll say it again, and this is where I have a tough time wrapping my mind around the fact that this is any sort of done deal to Alabama or that Ohio State's not a true contender. It is such a good fit for Keon Keeley at Ohio State from a personality standpoint, from a football standpoint, from what his interests are off the field, wanting to, be at a place where academics are taken very seriously. Alabama is moving up in that way. And I know that, people will maybe scoff at it like, oh, Ohio State's a football factory, Berm. They don't even care about, but that's not true. We all know that's not the way it is anymore in Columbus. The Buckeyes are very interested in culture, and I have a tough time writing off Ohio State just because he hasn't come right out and said Alabama is not my favorite anymore. But he never said Alabama was his favorite to begin with. So everything that we hear or see or speculate on Keon Keeley is literally just speculation. The kid himself does not talk to anybody about this stuff in any sort of official capacity. So is it a matter of being spooked by Alabama, or is it a matter of, oh, the Buckeyes don't have anything to offer him when Alabama does? Because I don't think that's the case.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that. I think anybody who's writing Ohio State off on this is being kind of foolish. 2 visits to the campus in a matter of a couple weeks is a pretty big deal. Like you said, just the culture fit, the positional fit with being a 4-3 defensive end. He seems to be really close with Luke Montgomery and several of the other 2023 commitments. And like you said, just the attention that he's gotten on the field the last 2 times he's been there, just from the pictures that I've seen, like it reminds me of, I think it was Friday Night Lights, maybe when Raekwon McMillan was on the field, and like basically he was flanked by Mark Pantoni the entire time. So it's kind of reminiscent of that. And it'd be great if this turned out similarly to that recruitment. But like I said, anybody that's writing off Ohio State, that's foolish. But at the same time, there's that trip to Tuscaloosa coming up. He's never been to an actual Alabama game day, I don't think. We've seen how the last few battles with Alabama have gone. So I think you're foolish either way, whether you're just saying, oh, it's done to Ohio State, or he's written off Ohio State, or I don't know. There's a lot of moving parts still to play out here, and I think the panic mode that's going on right now is in part because some people really did expect him to just shut down his recruitment and not visit Alabama, and I think we both said last week that would be a tremendous surprise if that were to happen. And
yeah, it would be uncharacteristic of Keon Keeley. It's not who he is.
Right, exactly. So I mean, I think you and I both kind of came into the weekend with that expectation that was still going to happen. And I think some people were just kind of praying for a bit of a miracle here. But he's going to get back there, and then I assume his family will sit down and make a decision. I don't know if he'll visit Florida or anywhere else, but I mean, we should have an answer here in the next month, I would say, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, and I know I've seen it speculated that, he had the Bama visit set up as the last visit for a reason. And I don't necessarily know that the way things worked out with that being the case was intentional. I don't think he ever anticipated making a second visit to Ohio State. So to say, well, sure, he could have just, if he really wanted to make a second visit to Ohio State when it mattered, he could just come up for the Iowa game. Well, that's a whole nother month from now. And if he's wanting to make a decision, which is the feeling I get, that he wants to put this stuff to bed because it's not something he enjoys, then why wait another month to come back? And to me, the fact that he made that second visit to Ohio State, you can't just discount that and say, well, he did visit, but now he's not, standing up on a mountaintop screaming, I love the Buckeyes and I'm going to Ohio State. And because of that, he's definitely not. Like, I just don't think that's true. But I do think that this is a situation where Ohio State is going to have to be cognizant of the fact that they're going to have to recruit Keon Keeley from here until whatever decision day is in a way that maybe they're not entirely comfortable doing. And I mean that they've shown him everything that the program has, right? He's seen it all on, off the field. We live in an NIL world, and I am an NIL girl at this point. And I think you have to find some way to show Keon Keeley and any interested parties in his family that are saying, hey, we want to know exactly what the opportunity is from an NIL perspective. You have to be able to put that on paper and say, this is what it's going to be. Now, you don't have to surrender your soul and make any upfront promises or any kind of stuff like that, or before he signs, before anything like that. But you do need to at least have a very serious NIL package put together. And we can talk more about what that means in a minute in big picture of college football. I also think, Andrew, that if the idea, and this is something I've heard speculated in and around the Woody Hayes Athletic Center, I've heard it from some recruits who've talked to Keon Keeley, there is a belief that Keon Keeley himself may favor Ohio State and that there are parties in his immediate circle that are pushing Alabama. If that's the case, the question simply comes down to, Keon, who's making this decision, you or someone else? Who is this decision for, you or someone else? And that is not an approach Ohio State generally wants to take with kids, because they certainly preach family. They preach the idea that they're recruiting a family and not just one person. But who's the guy that has to live in Columbus or Tuscaloosa? Who's the guy that has to suit up and play football in Columbus or Tuscaloosa? Who's the guy who has to get up and go to workouts at 5:30 in the morning in Columbus or Tuscaloosa? It's not anybody but Keon Keeley. So if anybody but Keon Keeley is the one making that final decision, then I think that it's a problem And I think that it isn't in Ohio State's best interest if that's the case. And I think they have to find a way to show him or tell him that without being demonstrative or over the top or standoffish. And I don't know, because it's not something they do often. Like, is that something that they're going to be able to do in a tactful way?
Yeah, and I think the fact that he did have, family members with him when he was on campus this past weekend, that's not a negative thing by any means. We've seen it so many times where I don't know how much of an impact this has, like family members, girlfriends, all that kind of stuff. It really comes down to what you said. He's going to be the one going to workouts. He's going to be the one living on campus, dining on campus, just all those things. And you mentioned the NIL, and I know we don't dig into those discussions too much, but I mean, I know there were photos of him at the foundation tailgate or whatever, and I don't know what that means or anything. I don't know what Alabama's presentation is like, but these are the two biggest college football powers right now. So you would think both schools know, both programs know what they're doing from an NIL perspective. And I don't know how one operates compared to the other, really. I know how some schools like maybe Tennessee or Miami are operating, and I don't think Alabama and Ohio State are kind of in that same stratosphere. But I don't know, man. I don't know how this one's going to go. Like, I agree with everything you said about the fit and all that stuff, but there's just something about that Alabama visit that
Yeah, it's
where it's
uncomfortable.
concerning, Yeah, it is. So
I think that the interesting thing here is that number of people I've spoken to in the NIL space have been very clear that Alabama is not wanting to be one of those programs that is making upfront sort of promises to kids.
Right.
But on the flip side, I've also heard pretty plainly that if it comes down to it and it's what they have to do to get the guy they want, they're going to do it because they get who they want at Alabama. And I've joked in the past that NIL stands for now it's legal. It's not a matter of like the fact that this isn't a new way in a lot of recruiting circles. Like, this is the way it's always been, and now it's just you can do it a little more up front. Bottom line is that it's Tuesday, 2 days after he finished his second Ohio State visit in 4 weeks. He has 10 days between now to visit Alabama until his visit to Alabama. I am confident in the fact that Keon Keeley is not going to go on the record and say anything definitive one way or the other. In fact, right now he's probably just hunkering down in his house in Tampa, waiting for a hurricane. So I don't think you're going to be hearing much from anyone in that area over the next couple of days. So this is a situation where I would caution Ohio State fans, and I guess that's my job here in some ways, is to be a hairbrusher. Don't freak out if you don't hear over the top great things about Ohio State from Keon Keeley or people close to him, because you've never heard him say over the top great things about anyone except for Notre Dame. But that's when he was committed to Notre Dame and trying to help build a class. So let it settle. Let Ohio State's presentation sink in and see if it's enough to win the day. And if it's not enough to win the day, feel some solace in the fact that the Buckeyes are going to continue to do things in a way that they think is the right way to handle recruiting. And maybe it's naive to think that can last forever. Maybe it's naive to think that you can be doing it in a better way than other schools when there are no rules right now. And it seems sort of silly and folly to worry about lines that you don't want to cross. But like, at the end of the day, you have to do what you feel comfortable like doing and being, and they want kids to choose Ohio State because the kid wants to be at Ohio State. So that's the message. If this is where you want to be, why be anywhere else? And it's going to have to come down to Keon Keeley making that choice for himself.
Yeah, I think from the fan perspective, and definitely like the message board fan perspective, like, people watch that stuff when a visit finishes within the next 24 to 48 hours after that visit. Are there a bunch of RPM picks coming in for Ohio State, or are people backing off their Alabama picks and all that stuff? Which in the grand scheme of things, it really doesn't matter all that much. But I will say, and we've always said this, like, if you're not leading for a kid after a visit, then the chances of landing that kid, especially when he's got other visits to make, are not the odds are not very high. But there's really no way to know if Ohio State or Alabama is leading for the kid right now because, like you said, he doesn't really talk to anybody. I think just the general assumption is that the minute he decommitted from Notre Dame, the assumption was he's going to Bama. But I mean, I don't know. He's never publicly said anything to kind of lead people that direction. I don't think.
The general assumption is that everyone that is interested in Alabama has Alabama as their favorite school. That is the general assumption. And so I don't think it's something that you can just take as gospel and say, well, there are internet recruiting experts and people who are close to the Alabama staff who say he's going to Alabama. Like, yeah, there are people close to the Ohio State staff who think he's going to Ohio State. Like that's just the way it works. The coaching staffs are trying to discern exactly all of these things as well. So I just think that, I'm not trying to blow smoke up people's butts here. There's a pretty good chance he goes to Alabama. There's also a pretty good chance he goes to Ohio State because I don't really believe any other school is a real contender. So I don't want to be 50-50 guy, but like, I'm not even saying it's 50-50. No one knows. I'm just saying it's going to be one of those two schools. So math is not my strong suit, but it seems like 50-50 when you're talking about that. Let's pivot away from that Tampa area high school senior and talk about another one who keeps being brought up in the world of Ohio State recruiting. And I get it. I really do, Andrew. I understand people. You see it. You think to yourself, hey, if Ohio State didn't want 4 cornerbacks committed, why did they have 4 cornerbacks committed? And then when one of them, Dijon Johnson, decommitted and then apparently wanted to recommit, why not just let him? Like that is a fair line of questioning, right? But here we are now 3 months after the decommitment, the desired recommitment, and his name keeps being brought up. I tried to lay this out in an article on ohiostate.rivals.com on Monday of this week. There isn't really a need depth-wise, numbers-wise for Ohio State to add another corner in the class of 2023, especially because they are very, very close on Bryce West and Aaron Scott in the class of 2024. They have 2 highly ranked corners in Ellis Robinson the 4th and Charles Lester the 3rd in the class of 2024 that they are very, very high on. That there is a potential to take 4 in that class, which may be more necessary. But you can't overcompensate in the class of 2023 because the current roster is thin, right? Like you want to get to your number. You want to get to 8 guys in the room. Right now they have 6. Only 1 guy leaves. Again, this isn't a math show, but let's talk about it. That takes you down to 5 when Cam Brown leaves. You add 3, that's 8. You're done. Right?
Yeah. I mean, that sounds right. And I know we just watched Ohio State play with Wisconsin with Jair Brown starting at cornerback, but obviously there's some circumstances that led to that. But I don't know. With Dijon Johnson, I've said this before. I've just got a thing with the Jeff Okudah type of long, lengthy cornerbacks, and he's that. But I also think, Calvin Simpson-Hunt and the guys they got committed now are all very good. And three's a fine number. I think part of it is Ohio State and Tim Walton and Brian Day are probably telling the guys they got committed now, like how they need to kind of handle things. And if you have this other guy that didn't handle things in the way that was expected and you just let him back in, that's not going to send a great message, maybe regardless of whether he's a 4-star kid, a 3-star kid, or a 5-star kid. So I don't know. My understanding and my assumption is there was like maybe a time period when he could have gotten back in and maybe he didn't take advantage of that window. And now it seems doubtful that window is going to open again. That's just my guess, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's a fair read. I think back in July, there was a moment when Ohio State, and this is what I want to say, the old adage, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. When Dijon Johnson reopened his recruitment, Ohio State totally understood why. Like there's stuff going on in his personal life that he felt like it was something he had to be close to home for. Then when he decides, hey, you know what, I'm going to see, I see that, but Ohio State is where I want to be. And that seems to be the underlying message here from Dijon Johnson over these last few months, because he still hasn't committed anywhere else. It's not like he's leaping to jump into another class. And so to his credit, he's been true to the concept of, hey, I want to see something, but he hasn't even made other visits as far as I know. So back in July, when he came to the Ohio State staff and made it clear that there was some interest in rejoining, when you get that opportunity and they let down their guard and say, hey, this isn't something we normally do, but we understand the circumstances, come, you're good. And then the message from the player is still, actually, I want to play the recruiting game just a little bit more. That is not how it gets done. And if Ryan Day's culture is being built on trust and the ability to say, we're putting all in on you, you need to put all in on us, then that is it's a hard pill to swallow when you again say, hey, we're not going to normally do this, but this instance we are. And then the player still says, actually, not yet. Give me a little more time. And that's confusing. Also, Calvin
Yeah,
Simpson Hunt is really freaking good. And people need to understand that. Like, that is a borderline 5-star athletic talent that people need to be paying a lot more attention to. I'm trying to get him on an episode of Talking Stuff for Birminology. I'm working on it, but he's not a kid who likes to talk to the media very much. So, but understand, like, the Buckeyes 3-man cornerback class of Jermaine Matthews, Keon Lee, and Kelvin Simpson Hunt is really good.
yeah, no, it's a great class they have right now. And I'm with you. Like, I do not think Dijon Johnson will find his way back in the class. I'm guessing he ends up at Florida or Miami or hell, maybe Alabama. But I will say there is a small part of me that wonders if maybe they get the 3 guys they have now signed in December. Maybe they keep up some lines of communication with him, and maybe they say, if you're really interested, make another visit up here on your own dime, maybe after the early signing period or something like that. But that's just a small part of me that wonders if that's a remote possibility. But I guess we'll find
Well,
out.
I mean, but that's ultimately the crux of everything right now with college football. Like, anything can change after December. When the season ends and the transfer portal
Yep.
reopens, you just have no idea what happens. You would think, looking at the current roster, that with Cameron Brown being the one guy in the cornerback room that is expected to move on because he's a 5th-year senior, the other guys are all second or first-year guys. So you'd hope none of them would feel like their time at Ohio State is over, especially considering the number of reps that Jair Brown and J.K. Johnson are getting right now, especially considering that Ryan Turner is getting a lot more reps than he probably anticipated in practice because of some injuries. So you have an opportunity to develop these guys in a way that you maybe doesn't you're always going to worry about attrition. You're always going to worry about transfers. You're always going to worry about roster shifts that you can't project or can't predict. But I think if you look at that room, you would be less worried about it than you would at, let's say, like linebacker or something, where you have guys who are 3rd-year players that haven't found reps that are getting passed over by young guys. So I don't know. I get why people want him back in the class, and I understand that his story, you kind of want to understand that it's not like he just said, hey, screw you guys, I'm decommitting because I want to go visit other schools. I mean, but when you have the opportunity to get back in the class and you don't, and again, that's just what the speculation is. That's what we hear out here in the world of recruiting. But it does seem to add up because it is in line with Ryan Day's general philosophy of with recruiting stuff. I mean, this was the case a year ago with Devontae Smith from Cincinnati LaSalle High School, or 2 years ago. Like, there was a lot of conversation that he wanted back in the Ohio State class after decommitting and flipping to Alabama. And Ohio State said, hey, you know what? Sorry, you made that decision. We're moving on without you. Do you think that they regret that now? Probably. They could probably use an extra corner, but say la vie. You got to stand. And this goes back to the point in talking about Keon Keeley. Like, you have to stand on your principles. And I know that's not always a popular stance around sports because it's win at all costs in a lot of people's minds, but whatever. What else you want to talk about?
Oh gosh, I'm just trying to think of some of the action from last weekend. I mean, Miami got crushed by, what was it, Middle Tennessee State, and I saw Jeremiah Smith had some stuff to say on Twitter about that. Just some emojis. It's impossible to decipher those emojis, but Ohio State. I mean, Ohio State and Miami are going at it for a couple guys. Most notably Jeremiah Smith and I guess Samson Okinola maybe a little bit. We'll see if he visits, and then JoJo Trader. So I don't know. I mean, I always look for like schools that are in recruiting battles with Ohio State and how they're faring on the field and how that might impact things. We always say that one game doesn't really matter all that much, but if you have a downhill season, that's not going to help things for a school like that, I wouldn't imagine.
No, I mean, and that's sort of the catch-22, because if you're Mario Cristobal, you are looking at this and saying, JoJo, Jeremiah, like, you're the guys that we need to change this culture. You're the guys that we have to. So it's different for a head coach in his first year at a program, especially one that he loves and he, was a part of. And Mario's not going anywhere. It's not like Miami's going to fire him. So you can sort of use it as a selling point in some ways. That being the case, if the offense isn't showing signs of life in Miami, that's different to me than a program losing some games. If they were losing games 35-28 and you need, one big playmaker to get you over the hump, it's a little different than going out and getting boat raced by Middle Tennessee State. There's clearly some question marks now percolating in Coral Gables about their offense and how it can get better, what they have to do. They went out and made a big splashy hire in the offensive coordinator realm, and that certainly doesn't seem to be, paying off. Now the question is it the players or is it the coaches or is it a little bit of both? That said, about Jeremiah Smith specifically, like I don't see, unless Brian Hartline and Ohio State just say, you know what, we're not recruiting you anymore because we've been waiting for a year for you to commit. Unless that happens, I don't see any scenario where they're going to not be the school that he picks. Like, I just don't see that. That's my opinion.
I mean, but Miami's believed to be the top competition right now. I can't even remember who else is in that. I'm sure Alabama will be in it, obviously.
Well, Georgia will be, but ultimately, this is about Ohio State and Miami. It's Ohio State where he knows the production is there. He loves Columbus. He loves Brian Hartline. The South Florida Express ties to Columbus are very real and tangible, but it's also a kid who grew up being a Miami Hurricane fan in South Florida. And it's now, again, as we talked about, and this has to, unfortunately, it has to be a part of every conversation about every recruit that Ohio State's going after. NIL matters, and Ohio State will have to deal with that. Now, I think what's interesting about the 2024 type players is that there is at least some belief or hope that by the time these guys are getting ready to sign and getting ready to move on to college, that there will be some regulation of NIL that's happened. And so it won't be quite as rampant and quite as wild, wild west, but you just don't know what happens. And this is ultimately the biggest concern I have. And I think a lot of coaches around the country would echo it about NIL. It is very difficult to make huge promises of huge sums of money to players who've never played a down of college football. Let's just put it like this. Should Jeremiah Smith, as a player who's not played a snap of college football, be getting more money to play for the Ohio State Buckeyes than at that point Marvin Harrison or Emeka Egbuka? No, of course not. And that, unfortunately, is the debate that has to happen. Should Keon Keeley be making more money to go play for Ohio State than JT Tuimoloau? No. And so you have to manage the entire roster. You can't just make all these promises to guys who've never played. That's a bad way, a good way to have a bad culture real fast. And at some point, and I'll get off the soapbox here, but the NCAA has to do something about that. Otherwise, we're going to see programs all over the country it's going to be college basketball, turning over an entire roster in a year. It's not going to be good. And so I know people want Ohio State to do more on that front, but you've got to stand for something or you'll fall for anything. You know what I mean?
Wow.
Yeah. That's brave commentary here. Let's talk about Ian Moore. I think that's one we should probably talk about. The 2024 offensive tackle from New Palestine, Indiana, made his second Ohio State game day visit of the season for the Wisconsin game. He is heading to Wisconsin this coming weekend. He will check out the Badgers and Madison in person. And ultimately, it seems like this is a two-team race for him now between Ohio State and the Badgers. Nebraska, Iowa have kind of fallen off over the last few weeks, and they were at the top of that, all Big Ten list with him as well. I think really I feel pretty good about my current prediction of Ian Moore in the class of 2024 for Ohio State, but Wisconsin's a cool college town. This is a kid from New Palestine, Indiana. It's not like he's from Indianapolis or someplace where he's used to that big city life. He's told me very specifically the size of the campus, that kind of stuff doesn't matter to him. He's looking for where he feels comfortable. But I guess if you're looking for reasons to worry, it's that he's a small town kid, and Madison may have more of that feel.
Yeah, I mean, if you're Paul Christ, last Saturday night was probably an unfortunate time to have him visiting Ohio State, I would say.
I would say as well.
But I don't know. Like, that one seems to me like it seems to me like Ohio State's clearly in the driver's seat there. I don't know. That's just my assumption. I can't remember. Does he have any sort of a timeline at all? Has he told you? I'm trying to remember.
I fully expect, with the Wisconsin visit coming up over the weekend of October 1st, that a decision will be made within 10 days of that visit. So I don't think this is not, Ian Moore, like a lot of offensive linemen / tight end types, like they want this over with. This is not a kid who wants to play the recruiting game. He wants to make a decision. He's narrowed it down, I think, to those two schools and ready to jump. Similarly, I think we could talk about Garrett Stover from obviously Ohio, Sunbury High School, or Sunbury, Ohio, like Cade Stover's cousin. Keep saying all the right things. I'm going to take my time. I want to be patient. I'm trying to wait till the end of my junior year. I will be shocked if it gets to the end of his junior year before Garrett makes a decision. And I think it's a situation where people will assume that Ohio State is going to be the choice, and it's a safe assumption. But it's not a scenario where Ohio State has taken it for granted. They have recruited Garrett Stover very hard. They love the fact that he's versatile, much like his cousin Cade. He can play safety. He can grow into a linebacker, and they just really love the Stover family, quite frankly, and you should, because they are really good, hardworking, solid people. So I think you could see both Ian Moore and Garrett Stover making a decision by middle of October, if I had to guess.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I think the last commitment Ohio State had was Jaden Bonsu in mid-August. So I would say, or would we say, those two you just mentioned, Moore and Stover plus Mylan Graham, those are probably maybe the ones to watch the most closely here over the next few weeks, maybe? Is that accurate?
Yeah, I don't know that Ohio State is in any hurry to take outside of Jeremiah Smith, who because they've recruited him for so long and he's such a different type of receiver, I don't think they're in a hurry to push anything at any other spot at wide receiver. They were the first team to offer Mylan Graham. He's been on campus twice this season. Brian Hartline loves this game, loves what he brings to the table. He's got to continue to take care of some stuff off the field, but also there's sort of this group of receivers that are all pretty similar. And I think that it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world for each of them to get a chance to visit Ohio State, and for the Buckeyes and Brian Hartline is to see them all in person. Tyseer Denmark out in Pennsylvania. They still like Micah Hudson in Texas quite a bit, but he hasn't visited, and there's not a lot of talk about that. Mylan Graham's in that group. I mean, I don't think that any of them are close to making a decision. And Mylan's talked about it a little bit, but I think no one wants to make a hurried decision. He got his first offer in the college recruiting process in June, so he's only been a recruit for 2 months, and the only place he's visited for a game is Ohio State. So I think he would probably prefer to slow down himself as well. Anything
that sounds about right.
What else you know? We can talk about a lot of stuff.
So, like, with the 23 class, I think we know, like, the remaining guys, obviously the big three defensive ends, and then maybe take a shot at Downs and Haynes. Is there anybody in the state of Ohio? I saw somebody ask this on the on the forum the other day. Like, anybody in the state of Ohio that maybe a late offer type of person? I would think it'd be like a running back or a linebacker, maybe.
I really truly think Ohio State is done at linebacker in the class of 23. I don't, and similar to the cornerback situation, I did write about it on Tuesday at ohiostate.rivals.com, that if you look at this roster of the linebacker room right now, knowing that you're going to lose to Roger Mitchell and Paulie Neoteote after this season, you could lose Tommy Eichenberg, Steele Chambers, and Cody Simon, right? If you don't lose any of those guys, you have way too many linebackers, like way too many, even just taking one in this class, because you get Mitchell Melton back, you have CJ Hicks, you have Reed Carrico, you have Chip Trainum, you have Gabe Powers, and then you add those other three guys. Like, in a team that only plays two linebackers most of the time, it's probably not necessary to have 9 linebackers on the roster. So I don't think they're in a hurry to add anyone else. Now, the disclaimer, I guess, on that would be like, let's say Troy Bowles decided he wanted to come back up into the mix, and that's probably the only linebacker in the country that Ohio State would still actively and aggressively say, hey, you know what? We don't need you, but we'll take you because you're a freak and that kind of game changer. Tackett Curtis, those other guys that they were recruiting, I just don't think there's any reason for it at this point, and they're moving on at linebacker. If you're talking about in the state of Ohio, I think the only real position to watch is tight end, to be honest, and that's Mason Williams from Mogador, I think is the high school. I'm sure I'm saying it wrong, or thinking of Lord of the Rings or something on Amazon Prime. It's a wonderful show. But him or Jackson McGowan, the Cincinnati commitment at tight end, the Buckeyes are watching both of them. Mason Williams actually did visit Ohio State already this season. He was there for the Toledo game. So you at least have some movement there. He's committed to Ohio. He's a 3-star kid, maybe a guy that could develop down the road into like a Reed Fragel type, who you just develop into an offensive lineman down the road because he's a really big tight end. But other than that, I don't think the state of Ohio, I think they're pretty much done. Now, if you want to look ahead to 2024 in the state of Ohio, which it probably deserves its own episode of talking stuff, there's certainly a lot bigger class of Ohioans potentially in that group. But I don't think anyone else in Ohio other than the tight ends is worth it. And, I mentioned this on doing the podcast daily rewatch with Bill Landis on Monday morning. We live in such a weird world of college football now, where if you really want a second tight end to join Jelani Thurman, or because you let's say Cade Stover ends up going to the NFL, which is a real possibility now after this season, and maybe that wasn't something you thought about before, you could, Iowa's offense is not very good. That's all I'm going to say. And there may be a tight end on Iowa's team whose father may be an Ohio State Hall of Famer and former All-American that Ohio State recruited but didn't offer out of high school. That you never know. It's a different world now. Different world, Andrew. It's a different world.
It is. I was thinking, when we were talking about the Ohio kids, I was thinking like Jacquez Keys, and then what's that one running back's name that you wrote about? Cornish, is that his name?
Yeah, those are good players, and maybe it's a situation where one of those guys, Trey Cornish, he's committed to Georgia Tech, but now you don't know what's going to happen down there. It's a different world at Georgia Tech now as they fire their coach this week, Jeff Collins, and you don't know if the new coach, when they hire him, is going to honor that. The other schools are starting to get in the mix for Trey. Maybe the Buckeyes get lucky and find another Southwest Ohio standout like Xavier Williams, Xavier Johnson, or a TC Caffey type around the state who has offers and says, hey, I just want to play at Ohio State. Because if that's the case, Trey Cornish is certainly a guy that looks similar to TC Caffey and Mayan Williams coming out of high school. I mean, he's a stud. Looks a lot like Mayan Williams coming out of high school, since he's playing at the same school that Mayan's from in Winton Woods. But I don't think that there's really a need to reach at this point. And more than ever, I mean, I've always written and said that like Ohio State's not going to do the whole, pity offer or desperation offer. They never would have before. And you certainly don't do that now in the world of the transfer portal, because you can, quite frankly, go take any player you want around the country if you're Ohio State or Alabama or Georgia, et cetera. So why do that?
Yeah, that's a fair point. I do. I dig.
So perfect. This is a perfect time to say goodbye on this episode of Talking Stuff. Andrew and I will try to do this again next week. We'll catch you up on what is happening around the world of Ohio State recruiting. The Rutgers game weekend is certainly going to be a down weekend for Visitors, we'll continue to chart those, but it will not be one of those highlight weekends. It'll be a day for a lot of the kids around the state that Ohio State's recruiting, maybe some kids from Michigan, Indiana, guys that they're evaluating, but maybe aren't all in on at this point, just to give those kids some experience. So we'll talk about that next week. And anything else? If you have other questions about the Buckeyes, the recruiting stuff, head over to ohiostate.rivals.com. Sign up there. You can use promo code DTE30 to get a free month on your subscription. You can talk to myself, Andrew, Austin Ward, Bill Landis, all over there, and hang out with us in the Horseshoe Lounge. Other than that, that's the end of this here episode. So again, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Please rate, review, subscribe, all those things that let us know that you're liking what we're doing. And we appreciate your affection. Goodbye.